In the spring of 2026, hundreds of ships stopped moving. Tankers loaded with oil, cargo ships carrying food and goods stranded, their crews running low on supplies, their cargo going nowhere. The reason? A single stretch of water, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, had effectively been closed to the world, and the United States had decided it was time to force it back open. Look at a map of the Middle East and you'll find it immediately, a thin blue sliver of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and in terms of global energy, there is nowhere else on Earth quite like it. The strait sits between Iran to the north and the tiny nation of Oman to the south. It is only 34 kilometers, about 21 miles across at its narrowest point, but through those 21 miles flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That's about 20% of all global petroleum consumption and more than a quarter of all the world's seaborne oil trade. Every supertanker leaving Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, or Qatar, virtually all of them pass through this one corridor. And in 2024, around 84% of that oil was headed to Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, and especially China, which receives a third of all its oil through these waters. Strategists have a term for a place like this, a choke point, and Hormuz is the ultimate choke point. Close it, and you don't just hurt the countries that export oil through it, you send shockwaves across every economy on Earth. You spike the price of gasoline in Texas and petrol in London. You slow down factories in Shenzhen. You raise the price of food shipped in refrigerated containers. Because almost everything in the modern economy runs on energy, and a huge chunk of that energy flows through 21 miles of blue water between Iran and Oman. Iran knows this. It has always known this. The strait is, as one analyst put it, a butterfly that can spark a tornado as far away as Texas, and there is no real alternative. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline can move some oil over land, but nothing replaces the volume that moves through Hormuz. The world built its energy system around this passage being open. That assumption just broke. To understand why American warships are now escorting cargo ships through Hormuz, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. On that day, the United States and Israel launched a large-scale military assault on Iran, the culmination of months of rising tensions, failed nuclear negotiations, and escalating confrontations. The Iranian military responded swiftly. Within hours, Iranian forces issued radio warnings prohibiting all navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. What had been one of the world's most vital trade corridors was declared by Tehran to be under Iranian control. Ships that wanted to pass, Iran said, would have to coordinate with Iranian forces first. Those who didn't comply would face serious risks, in their words. In the first week of March, tanker traffic through the strait dropped by 90%. 90%. For decades, the global oil market had assumed this corridor would always be open. Now it wasn't. Some nations received exceptions. Iran said ships from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan could still transit, but for Western-aligned vessels, the strait was functionally closed. Hundreds of ships found themselves trapped, either unable to enter the Gulf or unable to leave it. Their crews were stranded, cargo rotted. Oil producers in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq had nowhere to send their product and began curtailing production. The International Energy Agency launched the biggest emergency reserve release in its history, 400 million barrels, just to buy time. That's more than twice the previous record set after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and it represented only 26 days of normal Hormuz oil flows, a stopgap, not a solution. Other countries tried to protect their own. India deployed 5 frontline warships under a mission called Operation Urja Suraksha to escort more than 20 Indian cargo ships stranded west of Hormuz. France announced a defensive escort mission under Operation Aspides, sending 2 frigates. Britain, Germany, and Italy worked to support European-bound commercial shipping, but the strait itself, that critical 21-mile passage, remained under Iranian threat. The U.S. had so far kept its warships out of range of Iranian shore-based anti-ship missiles. That was about to change. The economic consequences of the closure were immediate and severe. Within weeks, Brent crude oil surged past $120 per barrel, levels not seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But this crisis was structurally different and, experts warned, potentially far worse. Previous oil disruptions usually meant one supplier leaving the market. This time, a strategic choke point had gone dark. The strait wasn't just limiting supply from one country, it was cutting off the entire Gulf Callus, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, all of them simultaneously unable to ship to most of the world. Oil producers had nowhere to send their product and began shutting in their wells. Iraq and Kuwait started curtailing production in early March. The gap between global supply and global demand was widening by the day. The crisis hit developing nations hardest. Economists described the Strait of Hormuz as an economic clock of war. A short closure causes an oil shock. A prolonged closure becomes an inflation and growth crisis that no strategic reserve can paper over. In countries across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, the choice between filling a fuel tank and buying food was no longer hypothetical. Insurance markets seized up almost immediately. War risk premiums for transiting the strait had already jumped from 0.125% to between 0.2 and 0.4% of a ship's insured value per single transit before the shooting even started. After the closure, many insurers simply refused to cover the route at any price. Ships don't move without insurance. That was the hidden economic mechanism locking hundreds of vessels in place. And for every passing week, the human toll was growing, not just in the Gulf, but globally. At the UN, Ambassador Mike Waltz said it plainly: no country gets to hold the world hostage for leverage just because they happen to sit next to a strait. Washington was preparing to act. On May 4, 2026, President Trump announced what he called a humanitarian gesture, a U.S. military operation to guide trapped commercial vessels out of the Persian Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz. He called it Project Freedom. Trump said the U.S. would guide ships from countries not involved in the Middle East conflict safely out of the strait, so they could freely and ably get on with their business. He described the hundreds of stranded ships as being in a desperate situation, with crews running low on food and basic necessities. The scale of the operation was significant. CENTERCOM committed 15,000 service members, guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, and multi-domain unmanned platforms, drones, to the effort. Now, despite the dramatic framing, it's worth being precise about what Project Freedom actually was. There were no formal naval convoys with warships sailing directly alongside each tanker. CENTERCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper described it as a much broader defensive package, clearing a one-way path through the strait, with Navy ships positioned nearby ready to prevent Iranian attacks. Think of it less as an escort and more like a defensive umbrella over a designated corridor. The U.S.-led Joint Maritime Information Center also set up an enhanced security area south of the typical shipping lanes, urging all mariners to coordinate closely with Omani authorities. Passing near the standard routes, the task force warned, was extremely hazardous due to the presence of Iranian mines that hadn't been fully surveyed or cleared. The U.S. had begun mine-clearing operations in April, but the strait was still not fully safe. At the UN Security Council, Washington was simultaneously advancing a resolution to hold Iran accountable for mining international waters. The diplomatic and military tracks were running in parallel. The question was how Iran would respond. Iran's response was immediate and unambiguous: Tehran declared Project Freedom a fire cease violation. Its military issued direct threats, warning that any foreign armed force, and they specifically named the U.S. military, that entered the Strait of Hormuz would be, in their words, targeted and attacked. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said the U.S. faced a stark choice, an impossible military operation or a deal with Tehran. Then, when the operation went ahead anyway, Iran acted. Iran launched cruise missiles and combat drones. Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels in the strait. A UAE oil port was set ablaze. Wall Street dipped. Oil prices jumped 5% in early trading, then settled 2 to 3% higher as the situation stabilized. The U.S. military responded forcefully. Apache attack helicopters and Seahawk gunships were dispatched within hours. By the end of day one, CENTCOM announced that 6 Iranian small attack boats had been destroyed in the strait. Admiral Cooper told reporters directly, "We have 864 Apache and MH-60 Seahawk helicopters used just this morning to eliminate 6 Iranian small boats threatening commercial shipping." He added that Iran's military capability had been dramatically degraded, noting that Iran historically deploys between 20 and 40 small attack boats when harassing vessels, and on this day they could only field 6. Iranian state media, meanwhile, claimed that Iranian forces had struck a U.S. warship with missiles. U.S. Central Command denied it flatly. Both sides appeared to be playing down the exchange, walking a careful line to avoid a full return to open war. By the end of day one, 2 U.S.-flagged merchant ships had successfully transited the strait. Danish shipping giant Maersk confirmed one of its ships had passed through with U.S. military protection. It was a small beginning. Hundreds more ships were still waiting, but the corridor was open, at least for now. Then, on May 6th, just 2 days after the operation launched, Trump paused Project Freedom. He cited what he called great progress toward a possible diplomatic agreement. The guns went quiet for the moment. This is not the first time the world has been here. In the 1980s, during the Iraq-Iran War, both sides attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf in what became known as the Tanker War. Iran struck back at vessels carrying Iraqi oil and eventually attacked any tanker from Gulf states supporting Iraq. By 1987, the situation was dangerous enough that the United States launched Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf under U.S. protection. The operation ran for over a year and involved 259 tanker transits. Tensions escalated into direct combat between U.S. and Iranian forces, culminating in the 1988 Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. naval surface battle since World War II, in which American forces sank or disabled much of Iran's operational navy in a single day. The lesson of that episode: Iran, when confronted with overwhelming U.S. naval force, can be deterred, but the cost and the risk of escalation are very real. And today's Iran has more advanced anti-ship missiles, more sophisticated drones, and naval mines scattered through a strait the U.S. is still working to clear. The parallel to the 1980s is real, but the threat environment is more complex. As of early May 2026, the situation at Hormuz sits on a knife's edge. Project Freedom has been paused. A fragile ceasefire is holding, barely. Diplomats, with Pakistan's help, are mediating between Washington and Tehran. 2 merchant ships have made it through. Hundreds more are still waiting. The broader stakes could not be higher. The 2026 Hormuz crisis has already been described by economists and analysts as the most severe stress test the global energy system has ever faced, more structurally damaging than the 1973 oil shock, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, or the 1990 Persian Gulf War, because it simultaneously affects all Gulf producers at once. A sustained closure doesn't just spike oil prices, it triggers inflation, it slows global growth. It forces governments that have nothing to do with this conflict in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia to make impossible choices about food and fuel. Iran understands this leverage completely, and Washington understands it too. The question now is whether military pressure, diplomatic talks, and the shared economic pain on all sides will converge on a deal, or whether the next convoy attempt triggers a confrontation that neither side can walk back from. What we know for certain is this: 21 miles of water between Iran and Oman has always had the power to reshape the global economy. Right now, the entire world is watching to see who blinks.